Hi, I'm Jason, and welcome back to Community Design Review, where we look at some of the most popular custom cards from this week on the custommagic subreddit. We have one meme card this week, and that is Mad with Power, 3 and a black for an enchantment. Spells you cast cost 3 less to cast, and you can't cast spells with converted mana cost 4 or less. Now, the flavor text gives you a clue as to what the intention is with this card. It's not to enable combo decks like Storm, because Lord knows we don't need another enabler for Storm, but it's just so you can cast really big fun spells cheaper and earlier. An interesting note about Mad with Power is that it's really hard to stack them, because once you've cast one, you actually can't cast a second one. Now, while it would be fun to cast really big Eldrazi for 3 mana cheaper with this card, the first thing that jumps to my head is actually, and I hate myself for saying this, using it in Tron. This will let you cast an Ugin on turn 5 instead of turn 4, which isn't quite as good as assembling Tron, but having an extra piece that lets you play your threats early might be really beneficial. Obviously, you'd need to be able to cast black spells then, but with Chromatic Stars, it might not be that hard, so this is definitely an interesting card, and I'd like to see what people can do with it beyond just hard casting an Emrakul for 12 instead of 15. For number 5, we actually have an entire mechanic, which is Desperation, an ability that gives you a bonus if you have the least life among all players. This is again probably a commander-driven ability, seeing as it has to do with a lot of players, but it can be good in one-on-one as well. Desperation is kind of a new take on Fateful Hour, one that I actually really like. Fateful Hour isn't that helpful in Commander because you're just never at 5 or less life most of the time, unless if you're in a strategy that's lowering your own life. You're so close to dead in Commander that almost anybody can kill you at any time. Desperation allows you to get a bonus even if you're just 5 or 1 life below all of your opponents, which makes it really interesting for a deck that wants to pay a lot of life, something like Crick, for example. Karik. I will say that these 3 cards don't impress me for Commander too much, and the other 3 are pretty cool, but I feel like could use some tuning. And I almost want High Captain Hope to have lifelink so that there's actually a tension between dealing damage with her and keeping her indestructible. I think that would be a really interesting balance to have, so that you're trying to build a deck around paying all that life that you're gaining, but sometimes when you just hit with her, she loses her indestructibility and can be destroyed right away. I think that would be really interesting to have to balance your life total back and forth like that. Overall, a cool mechanic, and I would love to see a couple more designs from it. For number 4, we have Goblin Puppet. 2 generic or a red for a 1/1 artifact creature goblin construct. Whenever Goblin Puppet attacks or blocks, choose one at random. Put a +1/+1 counter on Goblin Puppet, put a -1/-1 counter on Goblin Puppet. While I think this is interesting design space and definitely a funny card, it's absolutely unplayable. I hope that's not shattering anybody's expectations. A 1/1 for 1, or maybe 2, that dies 50% of the time it attacks or blocks the first time is not great. And even if it doesn't die and it gets a +1/+1 counter, all you're getting is either a bear if you're not paying the red, or a Goblin Guide without the Goblin Guide downside, but with a much greater downside. And sure, there will be games where you play this turn 1, and then every single turn you attack with it, you get a counter on it, and you'll win because you got a 1-mana 6/6. But half the games, it'll die immediately. And of those half of the games where it doesn't die immediately, a quarter of them, it'll die in 2 turns. And of those 75% of the times it doesn't die, then 3 turns later, it'll die an eighth of the time, and so on. And the upside just isn't that high. So, interesting card, not really playable. And number 3, we have Levy Appropriation. 1 white for an enchantment. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player controls more lands than you, create a treasure. This is a take on fixing White's ramp problem, again, most likely for Commander, though it could be used in other formats. How we've currently seen most mono-white ramp and card draw is when you are losing in some capacity, like number of lands or number of creatures, and that gives you a bonus, which is what we're seeing here. I really like this design, although I will say it could actually be too powerful. Now, I don't mind testing that out with some powerful cards since White's been so underpowered for so long, but say you're the 4th person in turn order and get to play this on turn 3. Well then, next turn, assuming nobody's ramping with any lands, even if they're just playing their 4th land drop out of hand, you're going to get 3 treasures off of this that first round. And if anybody uses an explosive vegetation or anything like that, you're going to get even more. Now, does this sound a lot like a Smothering Tithe? Yes. Is Smothering Tithe OP? Probably not, though it is very good. So I've kind of talked myself into it. This card's definitely not any more powerful than Smothering Tithe, although Smothering Tithe does give them an out of paying 2 mana, but this does give them the out of if that player controls more lands than you. So I think it's good as is, but I'd be interested to see how it plays for sure. And in case you aren't sick of it yet, number 2, we have Tactical Disadvantage, yet another card trying to make mono-white better in Commander. 2 and a white for sorcery, draw a card if an opponent has more life than you, draw a card if an opponent controls more creatures than you, draw a card if an opponent controls more lands than you. This is timely reinforcements, except instead of getting more things that white already does, it's giving you card draw, which white desperately needs. So I think this is a great card. I don't have a lot to say about it. Sometimes it can be an Ancestral Recall in white, which will be just sweet and I don't think is overpowered. And sometimes it'll be a dud card if you're actually winning, and so that'll suck. I think it's balanced. I like it, and for gosh sakes, let's just push white a little bit so that it can actually, draw cards. And finally, number 1, we have Census Surveyor, white, white, blue for a 2/2 creature human scout. All creatures your opponents control become legendary. Now, this doesn't have a lot of utility, but it makes it so your opponents can't have multiple copies of any single creature, which can be especially helpful if you're against a token strategy, blows up all but one of their tokens. Not a lot to say about it other than that. Pretty straightforward. Probably a little overcosted. I don't think it needs to cost 3 colored mana for a 2/2 that does a very narrow ability. I think white-blue for this would probably be fair. And sometimes it'll be really good, sure, but sometimes it'll just be a hard-to-cast bear, so... And that's all we have for this week. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and sign my petition to let mono-white commander decks draw 2 cards in their draw step.